Welcome, everyone. I'm James Jensen, a contractor supporting Western Area Power Administration and the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs Tribal Energy Webinar Series. I'm filling in for Randy Mannion as today's webinar chair. Today's webinar, titled Understanding the Power Grid and Organized Markets, is the fifth webinar of the 2018 DOE Tribal Energy Webinar Series. Let's go over some event details. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on DOE's Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs website, along with copies of today's PowerPoint presentations. These will be available in about 1 week. Everyone will receive a post-webinar email with the link to the page where the slides and recording will be located. Because we are recording this webinar, all phones have been muted for this purpose. We will answer your questions during the presentation. You can ask questions two ways. You can ask written questions by entering questions in the webinar control box, or you can raise your hand and I will try to unmute your phone in reasonably short order, at which point you'll be able to verbally ask your question. So, use either method that you prefer. If you submit written questions, we won't answer those questions until a break in the presentation. So after each subject area, we'll pause to answer those written questions. We will try to keep the webinar to no longer than 2 hours. Let's get started with opening remarks from Lizana Pierce. Ms. Pierce is a senior engineer and deployment supervisor in the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs, duty stationed in Golden, Colorado. Lizana is responsible for managing technical assistance services, implementing national funding and financing programs, and administering the resultant tribal energy project grants and agreements. She has more than 20 years of experience in project development and management and has been assisting tribes in developing their energy resources for the last 18 years. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Colorado State University and pursued a Master's in Business Administration through the University of Northern Colorado. Lizana, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, James, and hello, everyone. I join James in welcoming you to the fifth webinar of the 2018 series. This webinar series is sponsored by two U.S. Department of Energy organizations, the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs and the Western Area Power Administration. The Office of Indian Energy directs, fosters, coordinates, and implements energy planning, education, management, and programs that assist tribes with energy development, capacity building, energy infrastructure, energy costs, and electrification on Indian lands and homes. To provide this assistance, our deployment program works within the Department of Energy, across government agencies, and with Indian tribes and organizations to help Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages overcome the barriers to energy development. Our deployment program is composed of a three-pronged approach consisting of financial assistance, technical assistance, and education and capacity building. This tribal energy webinar series is just one example of our education and capacity building efforts. The webinar series, part of the Office of Indian Energy's efforts to support fiscally responsible energy business and economic development decision-making and information sharing among tribes, is intended to provide attendees with information on tools and resources to develop and implement tribal energy plans, programs, and projects, to highlight tribal energy case studies, and to identify business strategies tribes can use to expand their energy options and develop sustainable local economies. Today's webinar will build knowledge related to the operation and function of the electric power grid and organized markets, essential subject areas for tribes who are interested in developing energy projects and selling energy into the wholesale electricity market. The intent is for the webinar attendees to gain knowledge of transmission markets, management, ownership structures, transmission planning, and operations and fundamentals of the power grid. We hope the webinar series is useful and we welcome your feedback. So please let us know if there are ways we can make the series better. And with that, I'll turn it over the virtual floor to James and welcome Al, and hope you enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Lizana. Our guest speaker today is Alan Austin. Al is a technical lead in Western Area Power Administration, or otherwise known as WAPA's Power System Operations Office located in Phoenix, Arizona. He has worked in the energy business for the past 34 years and has spent time in both public and private sectors. He spent the early part of his career working in the distribution wires side of the business, but then shifted his focus to the transmission, generation, and marketing side of the business, where he has spent the last 20 years. One of his current responsibilities has been to keep abreast of the rapid changes that are occurring in energy markets and to identify possible impacts to WAPA and its customers. So with that, I'll bring up Al's presentation and he can dive in for us.
Well, thank you very much, Luzana and James. I appreciate the opportunity to make this presentation. I'm excited about this opportunity to share some information about energy markets and what's going on in the energy landscape in the United States. As James said, I've been in the energy business for a number of years now, and it's been really interesting to see the evolution of where we were back in the 80s to where we are today. And it can be somewhat daunting because depending on where you stand, oftentimes our only interaction with the power company is when we pay our bill and we look at our bill and, okay, I got to pay that. But once you start looking at your bill, it can be kind of daunting. It's what are all these charges for? And then you're driving around seeing the wires and wondering, well, how does that all work? And I think my goal today in talking about energy markets and the power grid is to hopefully simplify some of those things, these concepts, and to educate so that you as tribes, as you work your energy plan, can go about from a point of knowledge, and we can hopefully erase and eliminate some mystery to the whole energy process. So with that, what I'd like to start out with the next slide is I wanted to kind of give you an overview of WAPA and what we do. So as James said, I work for WAPA, which is Western Area Power Administration, and we're a federal agency. We're under the Department of Energy. What we do is we market, transmit, and deliver low-cost federal reliable hydropower to federal entities and preference customers. We've got over 700 customers, and these customers, our customer base is made up of just co-ops, public power entities, irrigation districts, a lot of tribes, and so forth. Next slide, please. And what we do is WAPA is one of 4 power marketing administrations in the country. So we've got BPA up in the Northeast, WAPA kind of in the Midwest and West, and then SWAPA and SEPA. Next slide, please. So our service territory, our customers are really, our customers here at WAPA are located in 15 of the western states. We're divided up into, 4 regional offices and then 1 management center office. So we've got things kind of split up by region. We operate 56 hydroelectric power plants. We've got 10,000, almost 10,500 megawatts of installed hydroelectric capacity that we market our energy from. And we also operate and maintain over 17,000 miles of high voltage transmission lines. Next slide, please. So as I said, our power comes from the various hydroelectric power plants, and these power plants were constructed under federal authority, and their intended use was their multi-use projects. And generally what we say by that is a lot of them were intended not only to generate electricity, but primarily to reclaim water. Some of the dams that we operate in the desert Southwest region that I'm a part of is we operate Hoover Dam, and its intended use was to reclaim and secure a large secure storage for water. And so we work closely with the Bureau of Reclamation, who operates and owns and operates the dams. And what we do is take the energy produced at these various dam sites, and we market it and transmit it and deliver it to federal customers all over the West. Next slide, please. So these as I said, these hydro projects are marketed on a project-specific basis, and these marketing plans were developed through intense public process. And part of these marketing plans, when the federal government built Hoover Dam, they built it back in the 30s, and then what they did is they developed a marketing plan to say, well, how are we going to take the energy from this plant and deliver it, and who are we going to deliver it to? And so they developed a marketing criteria, and the marketing criteria really says how that energy is to be sold, and then it actually designates typically some sort of allocation criteria to say, all right, who's going to receive the power, and what are the rules for delivering it? One of the requirements was that it's not intended to serve 100% of any customer's total load. It's only intended to really be a supplemental supply of energy for these customers. But each of the projects was built on its own, has its own accounting, has its own structure, has its own marketing plan. So they're treated very separately, but then we integrate the energy together operationally and make those deliveries seamlessly to the customer. Okay, next slide, please. So some of the services that we provide at WAPA to our customers, and you can look at us as kind of a utility, if you will. The only difference is we don't really have a lot of native load, if you will. We don't have a lot of residential loads that we serve. We're really more of a wholesaler. So we generate the electricity, wheel it across transmission lines, and then drop it off to smaller utilities who in turn serve those customers. But some of the services that we provide is we provide supplemental energy procurements. As I said, some of our customers, we deliver their federal hydropower, but many of them have come to us and said, can you help us procure additional energy? Because the energy that you provide to us as an allocation from that federal hydro project doesn't cover all of our load needs. And so we will assist them in making supplemental energy procurements. We do contract negotiations, we provide scheduling services, we help them manage their resources and help optimize those. We do demand forecasting. We have people that are on the monitor the grid 24/7, and we're constantly looking for opportunities to reduce costs. And then we do a lot of planning, and that's either on a short, mid, or long-term basis. So we kind of provide a full suite of services to our customers. Next slide, please. So does anyone have any questions about what we do, what WAPA does? And if not, we can just move on.
Yeah, so raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll unmute you. Al, I do have one question for you. So it's been pretty dry here in the Southwest this winter. Is that going to affect how WAPA, provides energy to its customers?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there is really a direct relationship between the hydrology or the supply of water or the level of water in the lakes and the amount of energy that we can produce. So we're constantly we coordinate with the Bureau of Reclamation, who handles all the water orders. So what the Bureau does is they take care of any of the water deliveries. And then what we do is it's really dependent on how a particular hydro project has been marketed. And what I mean by that is, let's take Hoover Dam, the Boulder Canyon project. that project has been marketed as a capacity contingent product, which means that the contractors, the customers, are entitled to get 100% of whatever the dam is capable of at any point in time. But that capability of the dam is going to vary. It varies from time to time based on lake levels. So Western or WAPA has no obligation to deliver any more than is available behind the dam. There are other projects, however, where we do forecasts out, and we forecast how much energy we think we're going to get off of the project or off of the dams, and then we let the customers know and we allocate to them a certain amount of energy. And assuming that our forecast is good, we may have to end up either buying or selling energy to make up for those obligations to kind of supplement. So we try our hardest to forecast, but it really depends on the project. But that's a great question.
Interesting, thanks. So we haven't had any other questions come in, so let's just move on. But audience, I encourage you to ask questions as they come up, because we only have one presenter today, so it can be as interactive as possible to make it as valuable as possible.
All right, what I wanted to do today was I wanted to provide you an overview of the electricity supply chain and where you fit in. Talk about energy availability and affordability, because those are really two things that really affect markets. Then we're going to talk about just some energy market basics, and then we'll discuss maybe talk about opportunities for the tribes, and I've got some resources pooled together that maybe I'll provide to you as to where you might go to get some help. Okay? All right, next slide.
Let's just stop here a second, Al. I just got a question come in.
Okay.
And it says, can individual tribes be WAPA customers?
Yes. In fact, we have a number of tribes who are federal hydro recipients for our various projects. So yes, an individual tribe can be a WAPA direct customer. And we've got many tribes that receive federal hydro power.
And then there's a second related question. Is all of WAPA's power allocated, or are you still seeking customers, particularly in the Southwest region?
All of it is currently allocated. We just went through a remarketing process for Boulder Canyon, the Hoover Dam, and that concluded on, and those new contracts went into effect October 1st of 17, and we added, I believe, 32 new customers and took some of the existing capacity and kind of parsed it out. I think Parker Davis project, or the Chris project, is going to be remarketed sometime within the next 5 years, but it's not a regular thing. These allocation processes are very timely, and when we allocate them, those contracts are usually like 30-year contracts, so they're very, very long term. And I think like I said, the next ones that are coming up will be either the Parker Davis or the Chris, but it's in a few years out. I don't know I don't know the date specifically.
Great, thanks, Al. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. Okay, next slide. So I really wanted to kind of kick things off today and really talk about the energy industry and kind of what's going on. There's a lot of stuff going on today, and if you're at all aware and you're kind of watching what's going on, I mean, there's a lot of news about utilities, markets, things that are going on. Some of the things that I just put down here, I listed some bullet items of things that have been kind of going on in the last couple of years. In California, they implemented an energy imbalance market a few years ago, and that's really been expanding. And so you've got a lot of people out west that are kind of joining into that marketplace. And so that's really picked up a lot of speed. You've got other utilities in the west who are exploring other market options. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more later on. I'll show you I'll give you some information about what's going on out in the west. In California, again, there's community choice aggregation is expanding. And what community choice aggregation means is you've got big blocks of customers, whether they're industrial, commercial customers, are banding together and then going to their utility and saying, look, we want to procure our own energy and deliver it on your wires. And what they're doing is they're aggregating all of their demand, their consumption, and they're going out and making purchases on behalf. They're taking control of their demand or of their supply, and they're entering into contracts, and then the utilities are delivering that energy and taking care of the wires for them. So it's really kind of a shift from the old monopoly utility model where the utility did everything from start to finish. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but that's really pushing this old historic utility model is really being pushed, and things are expanding. You've got wholesale prices for solar and wind energy are now comparable with natural gas. 5, 6, 7 years ago, they implemented or Congress instituted tax credits for solar and wind. And what you see, obviously, you're aware that there's just been a huge influx of solar and wind construction, not only on the retail side, solar on rooftop solar and that sort of thing, but also on the utility scale projects. And now with those subsidies, the wholesale prices for that solar and wind energy have been really now come down so far as to be directly competitive with natural gas and other forms of supply. So it's really created a lot of opportunity for those resources. In Las Vegas, you've got casinos who've gone to their host utility, NV Energy, and they determined that they wanted to, again, be their own supplier of energy and just use the utilities wires. And so the utilities said, if you want to do that, that's fine, but we are going to charge you a large exit fee to capture some of these stranded costs that we have. And the utilities, these casinos literally paid tens of millions of dollars just to pay off the utility so that they could then retain the rights. So there's a lot of people wanting control. There's expansion of wind and solar supplies in California. It's really posed operational challenges. And the grid operators, the people that run the system, are constantly looking for new technologies to integrate these renewables into their systems. And at the end of the day, what's happening is people really want choice. They want to choose who their energy supplier is going to be. They want to take control over their energy consumption. And what's happening is, and it's because energy represents such a significant portion of people's budgets, and whether that's a retail consumer or a business or an industry, energy is one of the largest costs to run a business, and especially in some businesses, it's actually the largest cost. And so people are very, very getting to be more and more savvy about what they can do to control those costs and control their destiny. So next slide, please. So you might say to yourself, well, yeah, that's really interesting, but what does it mean to me? Well, next slide, please. What I wanted to do, that depends on where you fit into the energy supply chain, okay? We're all consumers. We all consume energy, but really it depends on where you sit. Or do you self-supply your own energy? Are you a tribal utility? Do you have any cogeneration on your tribal lands? Do you take transmission service from your local utility? Is your load residential, commercial, industrial? It's like, who are you and how do you fit into the energy supply chain? And it really, all these issues and all of this variance in what's going on in the energy industry may or may not have an impact, but it really is dependent on what your situation is. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do is, let's talk about what are your energy goals? What do you want to do as a tribe, as an energy consumer? Is your goal to be more responsible and informed consumer? Do you want to maintain long-term price stability? Are you looking for supply assurance? Is one of your goals to be more environmentally conscious? Or are you looking to generate revenue and jobs? I mean, so really, it really comes down to what are your goals when it comes to energy? And really, and if you don't have well-defined goals, then my recommendation to you is to develop an energy plan. Because if you don't have an energy plan, then you're just going to be left to the beck and call of the utility. And so I know DOE has a lot of resources dedicated to assisting tribes in helping them develop sound energy plans. And so if you don't have an energy plan, I would suggest that you reach out to DOE and the tribal office and see what you could do to get an energy plan in place, because they can help you answer a lot of these questions so that you can kind of get a plan together to know you can be proactive instead of reactive. Okay, next slide, please. So what I wanted to do now is I wanted to really kind of talk about electricity in general and then talk about this supply chain. So the interesting thing about electricity is that it requires really a physical path, or the wires, to move from one place to another. Unlike the phone business, there is no wireless electrical network yet, okay? So electricity requires a physical connection from the point at which it's delivered or generated to the point at which it's consumed. Storing electricity, at least on any large scale, has been impossible, has been really impossible up until the last few years. And what we're seeing now is that large energy storage, battery storage projects are really popping up, and energy storage is one of the hot sectors in the power business because it's one of the new technologies that really shows a lot of promise. And so utilities are putting in battery storage installations to help them manage their loads and resources, and it provides them a clean, renewable resource that they can use to operate the grid. So that storage is actually really picking up some speed. The physics of electricity require a constant balance between supply and demand, or really bad things can happen. And so we're gonna talk about that, when we talk about the grid, we have people who consume electricity by just plugging something in, but there's people out there whose sole focus is to make assure that the power is flowing and that the supply and the demand is constantly in balance, and that lines are not being overloaded, power plants are doing what they're supposed to do, and that that we can maintain a constant, reliable supply of energy. And another thing about electricity is that producing it and all of the necessary infrastructure to deliver it is really a capital-intense effort. These are not insignificant costs. To build a natural gas power plant today is on the order of $750 million. To put in a nuclear plant, you're looking at just billions. Even a large-scale solar and wind plant is certainly a lot cheaper, but there's a lot of costs that go into producing, whether it's a dam, a natural gas plant, a wind farm, or solar installations. Because it's not only is it the actual generator that gets produced, oftentimes you'll need transmission lines and infrastructure to deliver that electricity to the grid. All of that infrastructure is very cost and capital intensive. And so utilities historically have been the ones to make those investments. And what we're seeing is kind of a shift away from the utilities to private capital. But the fact of the matter is those kinds of upgrades and modifications and things are very, very capital intensive. Next slide, please. All right, so to understand electricity today, you almost have to take a step back. And I took these pictures, well, I didn't take them, but I got them off the internet. But I thought they were really interesting because these are representative of how electricity was, how things really looked around the turn of the 19th century. So it was right around 1890 to 1900. This is New York City. What was happening at the time is electricity was very new. And so you could generate it, and there was a big war between Edison and Tesla, between alternating current and direct current, and I won't go into the boring details of all that. But at the end of the day, what happened is they determined that alternating current was the best technology to deliver electricity. And so what they did is it became very competitive. And as I said, you had a multitude of suppliers rushing in to create and deliver this new commodity to all of these consumers, whether they're businesses and so businesses, residences, apartments, whatever. And so what you ended up with was this, and as I said, in order to deliver electricity, you have to have a physical connection between the consumer and the supplier. And so what you ended up with initially was just this myriad of wires, because every different supplier had to build their own wires to get from them, from their supply, from their generator to the consumer. And so what happened is it soon became evident that it was just, from a logistical perspective, it was really a nightmare to be able to, it wasn't feasible to have all of these various suppliers basically trying to supply individual customers here and there. It became just a nightmare. And so what happened was, this is what drove the industry to finally get restructured into what became the vertical integrated utility structure. And that is, the utilities went to the government and the regulators and said, you know what, we will allow you to regulate us, but in return, what we're looking for is we will assure you give us a particular geographic area that we serve, and we'll provide the full spectrum of services. We'll generate, we'll own and operate the wires, and we'll make sure that that energy is delivered to the consumers, and we will subject ourselves to your regulation. And that way we eliminate all of the duplicity of effort and infrastructure. And in return, what we simply ask is that we are able to make a reasonable return on what our costs to do business are. And that's what really started around 1900, or the early 1900s. And that model has been in place and is still in place today. And it's interesting because that's kind of how we ended up with the standard utility model, or this, what we call a vertical integrated utility. That is a company that does everything and has a discrete set of customers that it provides energy to, okay? But this is the reason it started, was it was a nightmare. And in response to that, the government stepped in and said, okay, we need to do something. And so they implemented regulations to kind of control service territories. All right, next slide, please. And that kind of gives you an idea. This helps to kind of lay the groundwork to know how markets, where we are today with regard to markets. So let's talk about the power grid. Really, as I've been saying, the power is generated at a number of different power plants, and those power plants are fueled by nuclear, by various fuel sources. That power then is transmitted generally over long distances, especially out west, over long distances on high voltage transmission lines. It's usually brought into population centers, cities, towns, those areas, urban areas, and then it's distributed through a lower voltage distribution system, and then it's delivered to businesses, homes, residential, commercial, industrial users, and those types of things. Out west, the proximity of power plant to load or demand is it's far away. So it's very common out west to have hundreds of miles between a power plant and the load that it serves. And that's for good reason, because nobody wants a coal plant in their backyard. And so they were built way out in remote sites, and then hundreds of miles of transmission line were built. And out east, it's a little bit more concentrated and dense, but the concept is still the same. It's produced at a power plant, wheeled across transmission lines, and then distributed and consumed. Okay, next slide, please. So this power grid really is kind of similar to our roadways. The high voltage transmission system is like our interstate highway system. So if you think about it as the high voltage lines connecting these power plants to the load centers is much like our interstate highway system. And then at some point you hop off the interstate and the distribution system would be much like our city streets. The traffic gets distributed out to individual residences and so forth. So it's a fairly good analogy there. Okay, next slide, please. So what about the supply chain, and where do you fit in? So the way I like to look at it is, on the generation side is really the supply. That's where the actual commodity is being produced. And then we take that commodity and that megawatt or that kilowatt of energy, and we push it out onto a transmission line, wheel it across this transmission system, and then step it down on and then drop it off onto a distribution system where ultimately the load or the demand is consumed. And so most of the utilities, these vertical integrated utilities, were responsible for all facets of that supply chain. So historically, they've been the ones to go out and construct the power plants and own and operate them. They've built transmission lines that they own and operate so that they could then deliver this energy to this discrete set of customers that were located in a geographic service territory. And that's the way the utilities have operated up until probably the 80s and 90s, when markets began to get deregulated and we saw a splitting up, if you will. But probably 60% of the country is in markets, but about 40% is still operates in this integrated utility monopolistic, if you will, model. Okay, next slide, please. So does anyone have any questions on about this, the supply chain or anything I've talked about thus far?
So yeah, please raise your hand if you want to ask a verbal question. In the meantime, Al, we do have a few written questions that came in.
Okay.
And we're going to go back. So a follow-up question related to tribes and being customers of WAPA. It says, can you only buy power from sources within your region?
It really depends. As I said, it really depends on the marketing criteria, because each of those federal hydro projects has a marketing plan that it operates by. And within that marketing plan actually determines what criteria are used to determine how that energy is going to get allocated. So you may or may not have to live or be in that specific region or not. But if you're not, you may be disconnected from where that federal project actually can deliver. You're still going to have to make arrangements to move that energy from, if you're not physically connected, if your system is not physically connected to the federal transmission system, then you're going to need to make arrangements to move that energy from the federal transmission system to wherever it is you are. And those are arrangements that would be up to the customer to make. And that would go into they'd have to factor that into their decision processes to the economics of whether or not that federal hydro allocation would make sense to them.
Gotcha. So a related question, I think, would be, how does an entity know that there's an opportunity to potentially procure this federal hydro? Is there a central database, or how are potential customers informed?
Like I said, anytime these projects go through their remarketing process, which occurs very infrequently, there's postings on the Federal Register, and there's a public process that is gone through. And so, yes, there is a process. I think probably the best thing to do is I know WAPA, you can go to WAPA's website, you can contact them and ask them and have them. I think that the best thing to do would be to contact WAPA, and if you want to send me an email, I can put you in touch with someone here. And probably the best thing, and depending on where you are, whether it's WAPA or SEPA or SWAPA, any of those federal power administrations, we could put you in touch with somebody from that federal power administration who then could provide you at least the answer as to when the next remarketing of their federal hydro might be. And that's the key question. And I don't have that answer, but I could certainly get you connected with someone who could answer that. But it is a very long-term process, and it doesn't happen very often. Like I said, because the contracts are, 30-year contracts and 40-year contracts. They're very long-term.
Understood. Thanks, Al. And for the audience, Al's contact information is available on the last slide of this presentation. So we'll pause there, and you guys can write his email down if you want to reach out to him. Another question: what are the Las Vegas casinos that are leaving NV Energy? Where are the Las Vegas casinos that are leaving NV Energy getting their electricity from?
What they're doing, that's a really good question. So what they've done is they have hired a company who's a wholesale energy marketing company. And what they've done is they've hired them to go out into the wholesale energy marketplace and purchase energy on a long-term basis and then facilitate the delivery of that energy, and they just drop it right off their at Nevada Power, and then Nevada Power takes that energy and pulls it into their system to serve the casino loads. They just pool it with all the rest of their energy. And so there's companies out there that there is a wholesale energy market that trades every day for the next day. And so there's people out there who trade it not only hour ahead, day ahead, but there's also people who are trading energy in what we call the term market or the forward market. So it's an active wholesale commodity market for energy. And what the casinos did was say, we want somebody to do that for us rather than NV Energy, because we think we can control our supply. And they were really very concerned as well about going green. And so they said, well, if we take over the procurement side of it, then we can also control how green that energy is, rather than leaving it to NV Energy. So there's a third party that they went to who's doing all of their procuring for them.
Gotcha. So another related question, and this is, how do the casinos know the scale where it is a good deal to choose their own energy market? So I think that's, based on how much consumption they have, at what point might it make sense to procure your own energy?
Well, and that's a good question. So I think really what it amounts to is, what they've said is they've looked at their bills, and I don't mean to simplify, but I mean, really it's a matter of, okay, and most of your utilities now is, they have broken out their rates and they've said, okay, well, so what am I paying per kilowatt hour for my energy? And I think what the casinos have done is, these guys are huge consumers of electricity. They are some huge, huge loads. And so what they've done is said, look, if I can drop my cost per kilowatt hour just a penny or 2 cents, the difference is phenomenal. It's huge. And so what they did is they just basically compared the rates that they were paying to Nevada Power or NV Energy, and they simply said, all right, well, this is what I'm paying for them to supply it. I'm now out there I can go out into the wholesale market, and for that same amount of energy, I can get it for X, and yet Nevada is charging me Y. I think I can do better, or at least as well, but I will maintain control. And they've just done the economics and said, you know what, they think they can buy in that wholesale market cheaper than NV Energy can supply it on their own. And so they're taking on that risk, and they feel like they've made the decision that it's worth the risk to do that, and so they've done it. And they're not alone. There's a couple of them there in Las Vegas. There's one up in Reno that's doing it, and that's what the community choice aggregators are doing in California as well. You've got these large blocks of load and consumers that are saying, I think I'll go and buy it. I'll buy it myself and just use your wires. So that trend is really caught on. It doesn't happen real fast, but it is happening.
Thanks, Al. I did get something from the audience that maybe you can address. It says the WAPA remarketing date is 2028, once a decade. So the 2028 will actually start in 2030. Is that an accurate representation?
And it could be. It would depend on what the project is. Yeah, and that sounds reasonable. I don't know what project that is, because like I said, we operate a lot of different federal hydro projects. So undoubtedly, there's probably one that's up to be remarketed in 2030, and so they're starting in 2028 the process for going through that remarketing process. So that sounds right. But like I said, it's very much a project-specific process.
Okay. So another thing that just came in, it looks like we have a list of the remarketing dates for all projects. So if an individual is really interested, just send a question, and after the webinar we can forward you that list. So you know, we won't go through that list on the call today, but I can email it to you if it's applicable. So just if you're interested in seeing that remarketing list timeline, just submit a question, and we'll make sure and get it to you if we have that information. Another question. FERC Order 841 changes the value from avoided cost to locational values. Who determines that number? So you probably need to clarify that question, Al, if you can. But
yeah, and I'm not familiar with that order, so I don't know that I can. Yeah, I don't know that I could really respond authoritatively to that.
All right, sounds good. Another question. You mentioned about the AC, which is preferred. So could you explain why AC power was you know, considered preferable to DC? I think it's a little bit of a
yeah,
personal preference kind of thing, but go ahead.
Well, I mean, DC has its application, but the big limitation with DC power is distance. It's very, very inefficient for transmitting that electricity over a long distance. That's really the main driver, where the alternating current is much more robust, and so you're able to pump up the voltage and take that voltage to push it down the line. And so it really becomes an issue of if you're going to move AC is able to be moved across longer distances significantly more efficiently than DC current. And that's really it in a nutshell. DC current still has its place. I mean, we use DC current in all of our substations and that sort of stuff, and DC circuits are used on a lot of stuff, but for the transmission of electrical current over long distances, it just doesn't lend itself. It's limited.
All right, one more written question here, and then I don't see any hands raised, but feel free to raise your hand if you have one. Says, who pays for extending power lines onto tribal lands? Do public utilities have an obligation to provide service where there is none?
That's a really, really good question. And that's something that I think that's a really good question. And it really comes down to a couple of things. I think who the utility is that serves your area, and then, and I probably, from a legal perspective, I really can't speak to that. I don't know how the law is stated, but I mean, at the end of the day, it really comes down to whose service territory covers the reservation, you know, and because ultimately that's the first place that somebody would need to go, is to say, all right, well, whose service area am I located in? All right, what are their policies about new construction, and what obligation do they have to build? And it really depends. So I don't know that I can really answer that. What I do know is that that's part of what the Power Marketing Administration's really goal was, is to kind of bring electricity out to these to these remote areas. And a lot of our transmission system goes out to fairly remote areas in an effort to electrify the West, if you will. That was the intent years ago. But WAPA is not like I said, we deliver kind of at a higher voltage. We don't have any end-use loads that we serve. We drop off to other utilities and co-ops and irrigation districts and the like. And those are the guys that would really be the ones to be able to answer that question in terms of what it would take to bring service into an area that's not served presently.
Gotcha. Thanks, Al. There are a couple raised hands. So, Leanne, I'm going to unmute your line here, and you can ask your question. Okay, you're live. Leanne, do you have a question? You're live, Mike, if you want to ask it. All right, we can't hear you, so I'm going to mute your line again. I'm going to go on to Rita. Leanne, if you want to ask your question again, I guess type a written question. And Frida, unfortunately, oh yeah, your line's now live.
Okay,
yep, Frida,
great.
you're live.
I am with the tribal administrator for the Lumbee tribe, and we currently don't have a power project, but we are interested in looking at developing a project. And because we are state recognized, just trying to understand if Department of Energy can work with us, or do we need to work with the organization WAPA. We have a potential for a solar project and a potential. We are currently engaged in a dam repair project, and there's some potential for a hydro power project.
Mm-hmm. Where are you guys located?
In North Carolina, southeastern North Carolina, in Pembroke.
Okay. So I think you would be in SEPA,
Okay.
Southeastern Power Administration. So
right.
You're outside of, yeah. And what we could do is, that's what I would do, is there's a, on my slide I showed you that there's 4 different power administrations. And I think SEPA, yeah, so SEPA, I believe, is the PMA that's over your geographic area, but don't hold me to that.
Okay.
I think SEPA, though, falls in there. So that's where I would start, would be to, first of all, find out if Southeastern Power Administration if you fall into their geographic area, and then do they have any federal projects or federal hydro projects that they're currently operating, and then what services do they provide?
Okay, great.
That would be at kind of a regional level. Obviously, you're going to need to be in discussions with your local utility. Are you guys your own utility? Do you have like a co-op or utility that you currently take service from?
Well, our tribal territory operates under two different utilities. So
2 different utilities. Okay. Okay. All right. So obviously, that relationship is super important, and the more you understand about how they operate and how you fit into that, the better off you're going to be. And then the other thing is, I know that DOE does have resources there and available to provide assistance, both technical assistance in project development, those kinds of things. But yeah, there's plenty. I would reach out to the DOE Tribal Energy Office.
So Al,
a conversation with them. Yeah.
Al, this is Lizana. Hi, how are you?
Good.
Typically, by statute, I mean, our focus is federally recognized tribes, but you're welcome to call me directly, and we can see, what resources are out there. There's quite a bit.
Thank you.
Please feel free. I think James can probably get you my contact information.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, I'll do that, Frida. I'll send you Lizana's information.
Wonderful, thank you.
All right, so as far as raised hands, Frida, I'm going to mute your line now, just
Thank you.
FYI. As far as other raised hands, I don't see any. We do have a few more written questions that came in, and let's see if they're in your wheelhouse or not, Al, but if they aren't, just let us know.
Okay.
What regulator do you think is critical for future peer-to-peer transactions on blockchain?
Wow. Boy, I don't know that I can answer that. I'm not that familiar with that at all. So
Okay.
I'm going to defer.
Okay.
I'm definitely
And
not
then
close to the regulatory side at all.
Yeah, I got you. I think that's a pretty new area that I don't know anything about really, but yeah, maybe a different webinar potentially in the future. What do you
the
think?
Blockchain stuff's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Another question. What do you think of the trend of DC-enabled appliances, and eventually we won't need transmission and rely on distributed energy sources?
Well, that's a good point, and I think that's kind of one of the shifts that's going on now is right, that's one of the things that's really pushing the energy industry right now is historically, like I said, generation has always been located far away from the loads, and that poses challenges operationally because you've got long transmission lines that are expensive to build, to operate, those kinds of things. And what they're finding is, one of the things that's being looked at is what they call microgrids, where the theory is let's create sources of generation sources that are more modularized, more compact, are smaller, and move them closer to the loads. You're seeing that, rooftop solar, if you will, is really a trend in that way, in that it allows a consumer to self-supply, okay? But they're also looking at other ways that, okay, yeah, I put a solar panel on my roof, I can self-supply. I think they're also looking at ways that we can provide other ways of generating electricity and moving it closer to the loads for reliability purposes. It's easier for, if your generator supply is right there in your neighborhood, well then you're not subject to a blackout if that large transmission line is damaged in a storm. So those are the kinds of things that there's been a lot of activity in looking at how they can evolve and how they can modify their approach. But the challenging thing in the energy business is nothing happens quickly. And as I said earlier, these are capital intensive projects. Any type of change, it can be very capitally intense. And then it's a matter of, well, okay, so who pays for the generator? All right, who's responsible for operating it and maintaining it? Who's responsible for making sure that it runs reliably? Where do we put them? What do we charge for them? Who pays for it? And what rate? And so those are all things that it's where trying to get the technology to mesh in with the regulation and the regulatory side of stuff. But I mean, it's a really good observation. I think people acknowledge that the closer you bring the generation to the load, that you're eliminating quite a bit of risk. And it makes it operationally a little bit easier. But then, so it's certainly something that's being looked at. I just don't know how fast. Things are moving though. Demand side, they call it demand side management technologies are picking up steam as well, to where you could have the local utility kind of control the demand side of things from a reliability perspective. But I'm going to actually get into reliability a little bit here in just a couple of slides, and we can talk about that some more.
Great. That's all the questions at this point, Al. So let's proceed.
Awesome. So, like I said, what I wanted to talk about now is there's really there's two competing demands that affect the supply chain when we talk about electricity, which is one is reliability, and that's the demand for that reliable, safe, and constant supply of electricity, all at the flip of a switch. You know, I want to be able to walk over there, I want to plug in my charger, or I want to turn on the light, and I want that power to, I want that light to go on, and I want the electricity available to me 24/7, 365 days a year. I want a reliable, safe, and green supply of energy. But then there's the economics, and you say, okay, but I want it to be affordable, least cost, and I want it to be affordable and least cost. And so those two drivers oftentimes are at odds with each other, and there's certain costs. And so the energy business is constantly trying to balance between the demand for that affordable and least cost and making sure that it's reliable, safe, and constant. And so those are two drivers that constantly rear their ugly heads, if you will, when you talk about electricity. Okay, next slide, please. So let's talk about reliability, the first one. You know, and this really comes down to, well, so who's operating the grid? And when I talk about the grid, if you remember that slide, the energy supply chain, the grid is all of the generators connected to this web of transmission lines that are further connected to all of these distribution wires delivering energy from generators all the way down to consumers. And so that grid has to be operated. And like I said earlier, electricity requires that there be a constant balance between supply and demand, or bad things can happen. And it's really true. And so there are people who are monitoring the flow of electricity, that are constantly monitoring generating plants and how much they're producing, the flow of electricity on this web of transmission lines, and then they're constantly monitoring these loads or the demand, how much is being consumed, and they're constantly balancing and trying to keep the supply and the demand in balance on a second-by-second basis, because it's a constant dance, this balancing act. And there's people doing it right now somewhere on your systems and mine that are making sure that that balance is there, so that when you flip the switch on, the power's flowing and it's good. And so in order to do that, and that's a big deal, it's something that we really take for granted, but it's really something that's a complex process, and there's a lot of energy, figuratively speaking, being put out to make that happen. Back, there was a big blackout in 1965, and so as a result of this massive blackout in the Northeast, people said, you know, we need to take reliability a little bit to the next level. And so what they formed was an organization called the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. And it's a private entity that's funded by all the utilities and participants. And its role or its charter was to establish criteria that anyone who was operating the grid had to follow so that they could maintain a standard of reliability, some standards. And so what they did is they developed a functional model that defines all the roles and tasks that have to be performed to ensure that the grid is operated reliably. And what they do is they develop and maintain what we call reliability standards. And these reliability standards are the rules that people have to follow if you're going to operate and be a part of the grid. And what they can do is NERC really makes the rules of the road. And what they do is then they turn around and they can levy sanctions against anyone who operates the grid. If you don't follow the rules, or if you're not in compliance with their standards, then they can actually levy financial sanctions against you. I mean, it's that important to them. And it's really important just for the good of the common goal that the grid is maintained and operated reliably. Okay, next slide, please. So,
hold on, Al, just before we move on, clarifying question here from the audience. So the grid operator is essentially the DSO plus the TSO. So the ISO doesn't operate the grid, is that correct?
No, they actually do. That's a really good question. So, and I've actually got a slide here coming up that'll kind of talk about that. But in essence, the people who are operating the grid, actually, let's go ahead and I'll answer that question.
Okay.
So let me talk about NERC actually has some functional areas that they define. You've got generator owner operators, transmission owner operators and service providers, a distribution provider, and then a load serving entity. And these are some of the main functional areas that NERC defined. And these are functional areas of people who actually interact or have something to do on the grid. Let's go to the next slide, please. One of the main functions when we talk about people who operate the grid is, if you look down at the country, there's just this web of transmission lines coast to coast, right? And we're interconnected with Mexico, we interconnect up into Canada, and there's just this web of generators and transmission lines, and then consumers and meters and people who are pulling energy off the grid. In order to operate it in a cohesive, organized way, what NERC did is they said, okay, we've got to divide the grid up into logical pieces and then put people in charge of chunks of the grid, and then set the standards that these people will need to adhere to so that you can operate your little subset of the grid and make sure that it stays in balance. So what they did is they established what we call a balancing authority. And a balancing authority is just a portion, it's an entity that's responsible for running a specific portion of the power grid. And what that balancing authority does is they maintain the balance between resources and loads, or supply and demand. They manage the energy flows between their balancing authority area and all the balancing authority areas around them. So they manage all of the flows on the transmission system. They have to adhere to stringent reliability standards, and then they have to assure that ancillary services are in place. And so who are the balancing authorities? Well, the balancing authorities historically have been a lot of the utilities, okay? The vertically integrated utilities, they have a specific geographic service territory, and they've got all the wires, the distribution wires and the meters, and then they have transmission, and then they also built generators. Well, historically, these utilities have been the balancing authorities because it just makes logical sense. And so if you go out west, if you advance the slide, if you look at the west, these are the balancing authorities in the west. And so these are the guys that are actually operating the grid in the west. Now you'll notice on the left side of the slide, there's the state of California is called the CISO. That's the California Independent System Operator. So what happened out west is and I'll explain what happened in California because it's really indicative of what happened back east as well. And that is, historically, all the utilities up until the 80s all operated with their own little service territory. They would plan their generation, they would construct stuff, they'd build transmission lines, and they operated their own geographic service territory. They had a discrete set of customers that they had monopolies going, right? I have my service territory. I've got a couple of million customers that I provide energy to, and my responsibility is to serve those customers' load at a reasonable rate. And remember, they had struck this deal years ago. They are regulated by the Public Utility Commission, who sets their rates to make sure that they're not overcharging. And so these utilities also were balancing authorities. And so they were charged with operating the grid. Well, in the 90s, when wholesale energy markets began to take FERC, we went through deregulation, and they kind of split up the business, and these markets started to form. California was one of the first markets was the first wholesale energy market to actually form back in 1997. And the way it happened was the three large utilities in California, which was Pacific Gas and Electric, San Diego Gas and Electric, and Southern Cal Edison, three huge utilities, all formed together, and they went in to the California Independent System Operator. And so what they did is those utilities sold off their generators, and then they became wires-only customers. And they basically said, you know what, we're going to operate the wires, the distribution side of stuff, but we're going to hand over our high voltage transmission, and we're going to sell off our generators, and we're going to let the California Independent System Operator now take over all of the operational duties of running the high voltage transmission system, and they also run a market that they overlaid on top of that. So it's a socialization of the high voltage transmission and generation piece, and the independent system operator then became the balancing authority. So what was three balancing authorities became one. And that model also occurred out east. And so you've got organized markets out east, which typically are also regional transmission organizations, or RTOs or ISOs, and they also run as balancing authorities. So they do all that reliability responsibilities as well. So it's a great question. Okay, next slide. So let's talk about just some common utility functions and responsibilities. You know, what are these? Like I said, you know, we've gotten to a place where historically everything has been in this at the utility basis, but like in California, these markets and regional transmission organizations have kind of formed. Well, what are the functions? What functions does a utility, whether it's a co-op or a investor-owned utility or a public power entity, what are some of their major functions and responsibilities? Well, number one, they maintain an adequate supply of resources to serve their demand obligations. Okay, so that's what they do. They're there to assure that there's an adequate supply of energy to serve all of their customers. They construct and maintain transmission and distribution networks, so the wires. They meet all NERC reliability standards. So these utilities can't just pump energy out into the grid and run willy-nilly. They have to adhere, and like I said, most of those utilities are also balancing authorities, and they're also subject to those same reliability standards that NERC sets. They have to plan for future growth, and that's not only from a supply side, but they also have to go, okay, well, do I need to expand my transmission system because my demand or my load is going up? So they have to plan ahead to construct more transmission, more wires, and more sources of electricity in terms of generation, and then work those into their plans. They provide transmission service under a FERC-filed tariff, And then these utilities, typically, they have to establish rates through some sort of regulated process. And so there's just a lot of moving parts, you know, to what these utilities have to do, okay? So let's go on the next slide. So how do the utilities secure a reliable, low-cost supply of energy? Well, what they end up having to do is they've got to do some sort of they do forecast. They have to forecast their demand. You know, how much energy are they going to consume? And what I mean by they have to forecast not only what they're going to consume, but they may have also made some commitments to ship some energy to somebody else on a wholesale market. So they have to, that's all demand or an obligation that they have. And so they have to forecast their demand. Then they develop a day-ahead plan to meet the energy and ancillary service requirements. So then they identify the resources that they have available to meet the demand, which is, if I'm a utility, I've got what's my consumer demand going to be tomorrow? And have I sold anything to anybody else? Do I have any obligation to export energy outside of my service territory? What's my plan to meet my energy and service requirements? All right, well, what resources do I have available to me? And the resources that I have available to me as a utility is, I may have a fleet of generators that I own and operate that I can then call on to satisfy that demand for tomorrow. And so what I do is I have to decide on an hour-to-hour basis what resources I'm going to use to generate the electricity that I anticipate I'm going to consume during the day tomorrow. And so I have to put together a plan, and I'm going to economically dispatch all of my generators, and I'm going to have to put together a plan to say, okay, I'm going to use this generator, I'm going to start this generator up at this hour, and I'm going to let it run all day, and I'm going to start this one up during the morning peak as my load is really picking up. And then I went out and made some purchases because I could actually buy energy on the wholesale market cheaper than what I could actually produce it on some of my more expensive resources. And so I have to put together a plan that keeps my cost to serve load as low as possible. And then I've got to be able to make adjustments in real time to account for changes to demand and resources. And some of those changes that I have to be nimble enough to address are, I may have a generator that develops a mechanical problem that I have to take offline in the middle of the day. Well, I have to balance my loads and resources. And so if that generator trips offline, I have to go ahead and replace that power in real time. And so I have to build all of that into my plan for the next day, because I got to make sure that I'm balanced and that I maintain a constant supply of energy. So that's what I do as a utility, and that's kind of in a generic thing. But I either do that as a single utility with my own service territory, or I'm a independent system operator like the California ISO or a market, and I'm using the market to actually economically dispatch my generators and stuff like that. So anyway, let's go on to the next slide. So what the utilities typically do, and what they've done historically, is there are two kinds of markets. There's what we call a bilateral market, and that's where, if you think back to the slide that I showed you where we had all those balancing authorities in the West, each one of those is their own utility, and each one of them is putting together their plan for the next day. They're coming up with a plan to how they're going to meet their consumer loads. Part of that plan says, you know what, I'm looking at the wholesale prices, and I think that prices for tomorrow are going to be less expensive than it would be for me to run certain units. So I'm going to go out and make a purchase and make arrangements for some other utility to supply me with that energy. And so you put together your plan. Well, all of these utilities go out into this, what we call a bilateral market. And there's a market that runs every day for the next day. And it's like the stock market. There's like an hour opening in the morning where the market starts, trading starts, and then people buy and sell, and they make arrangements for the next day. And they make these day-ahead purchases and sales. So you got sellers and buyers that are making these transactions so that they can procure energy for the next day's supply. There's different time horizons. These bilateral markets, some of them are forward. Like we have people that go out and look at, they'll buy 3 months at a time, and they'll buy for next year. You know, there's people out, there's a market that trades for the next year. I can go out there and look at summer 19. You know, I can buy an April, May, June product in the forward market for next summer out on the wholesale energy market. And you can go out and commit yourself long term as a hedge to say, I'm going to go out. And so people do that. There's people that look at just the supply side of things, and they're coming up with supply strategies. And that's what those casino guys are doing. They're hiring someone to go out there in the forward market and say, you know what, you be our procuring agent. You go out there in the market, the bilateral market, and you secure for us a long-term supply. And so they'll go out and make energy purchases for next year, depending on whatever strategy works for them. The transactions are priced at $1 per megawatt hour, so energy is delivered. When you buy energy, you're buying a megawatt at a time. There's $1 per megawatt rate, and then the energy is delivered to you for 1 hour. And so you buy an hour's worth of energy delivered at a particular point. We have limited some hourly volumes. Typically it's on the hour, but we're getting into a point where now energy can be delivered in the bilateral market on a half-hour and 15-minute basis. Contracts are settled directly with the counterparties, so it's just a matter of if you go out in the wholesale market and you offer to sell, I offer to buy, we agree on a price, then that becomes a transaction between us as two individuals, and there's a contract that we sign, and we're able to get that done. Now, the problem is liquidity can be limited depending on the location. And what I mean by that is you may have a certain amount of supply. There may be less sellers than there are buyers at a particular location, meaning supply is not in great, there's not enough supply to satisfy the demand. And so that drives the prices up. But that's the free market, or that's the economics of the market, if you will, is supply and demand. But there are bilateral markets who operate daily, hourly, and very much ahead. Okay, way out there. So it just kind of depends on what your needs are. But those markets, probably 40% of the country operates in bilateral markets, and about 60% of the country of the energy served in the country flows through what we call an organized market. So let's go to the next slide. So this is just a graphic thing. I've got like a demand curve, and it's pretty atypical. So you got your purple line there. You would plot out, well, what's my hourly consumption or my demand, and then you would you would put together a plan to figure out how you're going to serve or how you're going to meet that demand. And that can be made up of various generators. You can go out and make purchases to supplement, and you can even make long-term purchases that you would call on, or you can just buy hourly to kind of on a more refined basis, or you can self-supply if you have the resources. So anyway, there's a lot of planning going on. Okay, next slide, please. So what's the difference between the bilateral market and these centralized markets? Because I think that's, like I said, 60% of the country, or 60% of the energy produced in the country flows through centralized markets, and about 40% flows through the bilateral markets, and that's according to the Energy Information Administration. So, as I said, bilateral markets, you have one party sells to another. It's kind of like buying a car. You know, two of us agree, you agree to sell, I agree to buy, we agree to terms, we sign a contract, and we make it happen. They're hourly transactions, but they're typically poorly matched to increasing amounts of renewable generation. So there's some challenges in the bilateral market when it comes to renewable generation, because sometimes that renewable generation isn't there all the time. It's intermittent because of the clouds come over, and so it's hard to commit your solar plant. When, you know, there's a disjoint between making a commitment to deliver and then actually delivering, and so it gets challenging. Under a bilateral market, you really have fragmented operating footprints, and they result in there's a lot of inefficiencies built into. There's a lot of inefficiencies that are in the bilateral market, and that is, you know, typically we're only buying and selling in hourly increments. And so each of the utilities then are left to themselves to have to balance from hour to hour. So if there's variations in load within the hour, and if a generator trips offline 15 minutes into the hour, then the next hour doesn't start for 45 minutes, right? And so you may have made a purchase and that energy isn't scheduled to come in until the start of the hour. Well, the balancing authority of the utility then has to make that up on their own. And so they're on the hook to balance their own loads and resources within their own area. And so there's some inefficiencies and challenges there because they're very balkanized and fragmented, okay? But that's the way it's operated, and they usually have a broad fleet, and they're able to do that. It just oftentimes may not be at the most economical, in the most economical fashion. And then there's the last bullet is there's limited visibility to conditions on the neighboring systems, and that can create some reliability issues. So if all I'm looking at is my balancing authority area or my area of the grid, oftentimes I don't see what's going on around me, right? And so there may be reliability conditions that I need to be privy to, which would help me actually contribute to reliability and to make it more reliable. And so bilateral markets can have a certain degree of limiting visibility when it comes to reliability and that sort of thing. Whereas under the RT on these centralized markets, electricity products are really cleared by a centralized market operator. It's kind of like the stock market. Transactions are usually the market. What the market does is it does like a forecast. Just like I said, the utility has to plan and forecast what they're going to need for the next hour or the next day. Then they have to come up with a plan where they say, well, what resources am I going to use? And then they're going to use the cheapest first generally, and then go to the most expensive, and then supplement that with purchases if they can purchase in the market at a price that's cheaper than their next most expensive generator. Well, that's what the central market actually does, is it provides a mechanism whereby generators and suppliers can offer all of their generators into the marketplace, and the market actually picks and it processes and it facilitates all of those generator resources, so that ultimately all the consumers then, what the market does is it satisfies the supply demands. It satisfies the demands with the supplies that are offered into the market, and it picks the least expensive resource and then compensates the generators. And it does that, and it issues dispatches to the generators to say, okay, I picked you for the next 5 minutes, and I need you to move your unit up a couple of megawatts. And then it also establishes a price based on what based on bids and offers. And it's this huge machine that just churns along. Every 5 minutes, it's creating a new solution to that problem of how am I going to most economically serve that load? How am I going to most economically serve that load? And it does the forecast, it comes up with a solution, and then it issues the dispatch and moves the units around. And it's automated. It operates on a larger operating footprint, has diversity, and typically these RTOs and ISOs are also the balancing authority. So not only are they using the market to access the most economical supply of generators or energy, they are also using the market to supply them all of the resources that they need to satisfy their reliability requirements of operating a balancing authority. And that's a key piece. And so they're kind of taking care of both of those features at once, all right? So there's a lot more efficiency involved, or there's efficiencies that can be gleaned and realized by centralizing and socializing, the generation and the transmission. At least that's the idea. Okay, next slide, please.
Al, we had a couple questions that are applicable here.
Okay.
So is an RTO the same as an ISO, or what's the distinction?
They are the same. Those terms are really synonymous. The key to remember is if I'm a regional transmission organization or an RTO or a independent system operator, it's pretty much synonymous. Like I said, what's happened is when the electrical industry was deregulated back in 97, 98, FERC issued orders that said, okay, I'm going to try and break up the monopolies. And what they said was, what happened up to that point was there was a lot of the utilities were kind of hoarding their transmission, and they weren't allowing third parties to have access to their transmission lines to wheel stuff across their system. So FERC said, no, that's not good. So they split off the generation side and said, okay, you've got to separate, and the generation side of things, the supply side, has to be separate from the transmission side. And that's what they did, is they split the two groups. And they said, okay, generation is just supply, and that was deregulated, and that's what feeds into the wholesale energy market, is all these generators, the suppliers, the people that produce. The wire side is the side of the business, taking it from the generator down to the load. The wire side of the business is definitely regulated, and that has been regulated, and it continues to be regulated. And the reason behind that is they want to provide, FERC's intent is that that utilities don't hoard transmission capacity. They don't hoard and gobble up all this transmission capacity on their wires for their own use, but they make it available for others, so they're allowed to use enough that they need to serve their own needs. But if they have excess capacity, they have to make it available for other people to purchase. And then the rates that they charge have to be rates that FERC approves. And so there's a whole process for that. So the transmission side is very regulated. What the RTOs do and the ISOs is they take that transmission system, and the transmission owners have really handed the keys over to the RTO and said, here's our transmission system, you drive it, you operate it, we'll collect the money. Okay? They still maintain ownership of it, they still have to maintain it, but the independent system operator, the RTO, operates it and uses that network to run their market on. And so the market actually says, okay, here's my load, here's my demand side, my loads, I've got this transmission system, all my generators are going to be putting in offers to sell, what are the prices, what's my load, and then they utilize all that data and they say, okay, well, we can satisfy that requirement. They use the market to actually satisfy the load demands at the lowest cost.
Gotcha. Another related question on bilateral markets. Who organizes and maintains and facilitates that bilateral market?
Well, there's a couple of things. They run, I know out west, that there are trading hubs. There really is no like bilateral, it's not like the New York Stock Exchange where there's an organization that operates it. What there is there's a couple of trading platforms. There's one in particular that's commonly used called Interconnection Exchange, and it's just a computer platform, trading platform that people join, and then you have to kind of get cleared and you get set up, and it's kind of an industry facilitated market. People just have kind of gotten together and they've got enabled with each other and said, okay, well, this is when we're going to run the market between this time and that time. And then people simply, they've agreed on, well, here's certain places that we're going to trade at. And they're typically large switch yards and common receipt and delivery points on the transmission grid. And out west, they operate they trade day ahead every morning, Monday through Friday, and then in real time, there's different people. So there's really a day ahead market is facilitated with an online trading platform. The forward market is a little bit different in that some of it happens on that platform, but a lot of times people will go out in the forward market, and what they'll do is just issue like an RFP, and they have a list of potential suppliers, and a potential buyer will distribute, they'll issue a request for information, or they'll go out and put out a request for proposal, if you will, and they'll formalize that request saying, I'm interested, I am company XYZ, I am interested in buying so many megawatts of energy for this period of time, this product at this delivery point, and then they publish that. You know, they'll put out an email and send it to all these suppliers, and then they'll say, okay, please submit your offers by this date. You know, it'd be usually like the next day or two. And so there's an RFP process that you go through, and then some people. So there's a lot of different ways that deals get done, but it happens, and there's a lot of that bilateral activity is happening out there.
Great. All right. Well, let's move on. We're getting close to the end of the hour, so at the end of the 2 hours, I should say. Although, Al, if you do have time, we can probably run a little bit over if you're able to.
Okay. All right, next slide. Well, here are the RTOs in North America. And like I said, these are the regional transmission organizations that are in North America. All right. Anything that's colored is an RTO. And they've been around since, like I said, the California was from 1997 on, and then the other ones have kind of come along thereafter. Anything that's in white, which is predominantly the majority of the West and the Southeast, those actually operate in the bilateral market. So those are utilities that are just standalone utilities, and they're not under an organized energy market or an RTO. Okay. Next slide. So how is the centralized market different than what we have now? Well, this is kind of a repeat of kind of what I told you before I got ahead of myself. So on the left, this is how things occur without a market. As I said, each BA's got to balance their own loads and resources within its borders. So you're very autonomous. You're focusing on balancing your own loads and resources. Whereas on the left or on the right in a market, the market dispatches resources across the BA boundaries or within the market footprint to balance the energy. And so it really gives you enhanced situational awareness, more flexibility. It allows you to do stuff on a more refined basis, more on a 5-minute dispatch than on an hourly dispatch. It decreases your integration costs, and it's economically, from a supply standpoint, gives the consumer access to, it gives the consumer or the utility, the market participant, access to potentially cheaper energy than they would have access to otherwise. Next slide. So what's an RTO? They're an independent operator of the transmission system and generation resources, but they don't own them. So like I said, somebody's handed over the keys and say, you operate it, and we'll go ahead and retain ownership and we'll continue to maintain it. They maintain a wide area of overview of the entire footprint. They operate and oversee a centralized market for energy and ancillary services. They're typically a reliability coordinator. And then what they do is they facilitate transmission planning. That's part of that planning process to look at potential transmission expansion. So they're constantly looking out ahead to see where the growth is, to see where they need to build new transmission lines and to keep ahead of growth. And so they kind of facilitate that. And then they also perform market monitoring to assure that people are behaving as they should under the market. Okay, next slide. So what's happening out in California? I said they stood up what we call an energy imbalance market. They actually have a full 2-day market and an RTO going on. But what's happened in the West is there were a lot of companies. There's 37 balancing authorities out in the West. And a lot of them have tried to, this idea about, they've tried to glean the benefits of operating under a common footprint, but getting there has been very challenging, right? And so as an interim step, what California did was, okay, rather than expand the RTO, what they said was, all right, well, why don't we will offer real-time energy only. That means we will offer that 5-minute dispatch and let people offer their generators in to the market, and we're going to run a special market hourly just for balancing energy within the hour. They're not going to do anything day ahead, and it only is there to balance. And it's therefore, as you recall, in the bilateral market, you buy and sell, and you buy and sell at the by hour to hour. And so what I said was that the balancing authorities are on their own between the beginning of the hour and the end of the hour. They have to balance their system within that hour using their own resources, okay? And that can be challenging, it can be more expensive, and it can be inefficient because they can't do anything else, right? They're left with what they have. The Cal ISO recognized that and said, they stood up a market that said, all right, we are going to offer a place where you as utilities and balancing authorities can offer in any excess generation capacity that you have to make available to others who may need it during the hour, within the hour, on a 5-minute basis. And we will facilitate putting buyers and sellers together within the hour. And that's what the energy imbalance market does. They stood it up, and it's really taken off to where they've got a bunch of people who've joined in because they're reaping the benefits of balancing their system within the hour with energy from the market as opposed to energy that they have to self-supply. And so it's really become, it's been a real success in terms of growth out west. So next slide, I think I've got a picture of it. Because there are a couple of different initiatives going on out in the west. Because what I really wanted, and we're kind of getting close to wrapping it up. So what I've done is kind of introduce this idea of, I've tried to contrast what it's like to operate alone as a standalone utility and a BA, and reliability-wise and economically and historically, everyone's kind of been balkanized. But what's happened is, over time, since the late 90s, early 2000s, about 60% of the country has kind of migrated towards these RTOs and organized markets, and they've moved that direction. Okay. Well, out west, everything has been a lot slower, and so a lot of the utilities out west have really struggled with they've recognized that there's value in potentially operating more efficiently, and so they've wanted to avail themselves of that benefit, but it's a very complex process. And so the Cal ISO, like I said, stood up their energy imbalance market, which is one of the initiatives that's really going on out here in the west. And you can see on this map that the California independent system operators in yellow, kind of the yellow mustardy color, and then all of those other entities that are in orange and a couple in blue are utilities in the west who have joined or have committed to join the California energy imbalance hourly market. And so they've really kind of taken hold, and that's really picked up a lot of steam. Now, related though, there's some other initiatives that have been going on. We've got some utilities in the Southwest. The Southwest Markets Alternatives Group, which is SMAG, and they're looking at potentially, to see is there a way that do we want to stand up our own market? Do we want to form an RTO? That sort of thing. We've got the Mountain West Transmission Group, which is a bunch of utilities on the Front Range up in Colorado, and they've done a lot of work to come up with a common tariff, and so they're looking at markets. And then you've got also Peak Reliability is an entity that does all the reliability coordination services for the Western interconnection, and they've joined up with PJM Connects, and PJM is one of the markets from back east. And what they've done is joined up together and said they're offering to stand up a market for folks out in the West. And so right now you're in a situation where you've got utilities out west that are very balkanized. They're trying to try to do stuff together, and there's a lot of different initiatives out there trying to satisfy that need and demand. So things are constantly changing, and so it's really interesting to see where things are at, but there's a lot of changes going on out west. Next slide. So that said, what are some of the opportunities for tribes? I mean, after all of that said and done, what does it mean to you guys? Well, I'm going to go right back to the core. What I said really, really early on is, if you don't have an energy plan, I really, really would encourage you to develop one. Because if you don't have a goal, if you don't know what you're shooting for, then you're not going to get anything, and you're just going to be you're going to be a price taker. You'll just end up paying whatever they charge. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of resources out there to help you develop an energy plan. Another thing is, one of the options that you can do is explore partnership opportunities with your host utility, because at the end of the day, you're connected to somebody, and like it or not, you're connected. And so it's in the tribe's interest to get to know who your utility is, what services they're providing you, where they services. Do they provide them? Do they procure themselves and then provide them to you? and then understand where do you fit in that supply chain along with the utility. What roles does the utility play, and where do you fit? Because you may have things that your utility may want. And so when it comes to looking for opportunities to do business, it's critical that you understand, do you have something that they may want or need? And conversely, where are their interests? And can you come together on those? But having a plan will help you to at least define what your goals are. Then determine, well, if one of your goals is to reduce your overall cost to consume, well then that's something that you could potentially partner with the utility to say, well, I'd like to negotiate some new rates, or I did a rate study and I'd like to, and you can be proactive. They may have some program your goals, depending on what those goals are. Is one of your goals to self-supply? Do you want to be your own supplier of energy? Do you want to form a tribal utility? We've had tribes out west that have formed tribal utilities and been pretty successful at it and brought a lot of benefit in terms of securing long-term energy supplies as well as creating jobs. Get to know where you fit into the supply chain and what that means. And then I think at the end of the day, too, there's a lot of value in engaging with other tribes. There are a lot of tribes who've done some really, really cool stuff. I mean, there's tribes out there that have partnered with developers and built large utility scale solar projects, and other tribes who have just put in like community scale solar projects to secure, to reduce their overall costs, and other tribes that are really at the outset are just trying to bring electricity to all their tribal members. I mean, there's a broad spectrum of experience out there, but I would say, engage with the other tribes, engage with the Indian Tribal Energy Office. There are a lot of resources available to you to help you even develop a plan and then to help you execute on that plan. The opportunity to present to you guys. I appreciate you letting me go on for the last couple hours. I am passionate about this. Energy is, my hope is that hopefully things have gotten a little clearer. I don't want to muddy the water. I want to bring clarity. And any of you that have questions that you feel you'd like to, that weren't resolved or answered, feel free to contact me directly. I've got my contact information there. I've also included some resource here with some links of things that you can kind of go to that will give you hopefully some things that will kind of help you educate, get a little bit more knowledge and education about energy markets and what they mean. And by all means, contact me directly if you have questions. I'd be more than happy to get you connected with somebody who can answer your questions if I can't. And with that, I turn the floor back over to James.
Okay, Al, if you do have a little bit more time, we do have a couple questions.
Sure, absolutely.
We can wrap it up. But all right, so there's a question here. It says, if a tribe is generating power on the reservation for tribal use but has excess power to sell back to the grid, how do they find a buyer for that excess power if the local utility is not, interested in or not working with them?
That's a good question. What you can do is, so if the local utility is not interested in, or first of all, it would depend on, if you want to get into the wholesale market, okay, one of the big things is you need to know where is the energy, where is it being produced, and then where can you deliver it to? Because the wholesale energy market trades at specific hubs, and these are generally physical locations, like at a switching yard or a substation is kind of a common delivery point that's used by people who move energy around. And so you'd have to really find out, you'd have to get a hold of someone in your area who's got some expertise relative to what the market does and how it operates there in your area. First thing is I would want to know, are you in a bilateral market area or do you fall under an organized market? If the utility not interested in buying the power because they don't think it's worth what you think it is, or what the obstacle is it because it's being produced in hours that they don't need it? I'd be curious to know why they're not interested in it. It may be they just don't have the load for it, but it may be that, wow, well, when it's available, I really can't use it, but if I could have it during these hours, then it might be useful to me. So I'd really be looking at better understanding why the lack of appetite. But if you want to get into the wholesale market, you've got to look at where's it going to be traded, and then how am I going to move it from where it's being generated to where would need to be sold. And you'd have to do the economic analysis to say, can I sell it at a price that would allow me to cover all of my delivery costs in order to do that? And then so I would try to figure out, where you're at and reach out to some one of your power marketing administrations, or there's companies out there that have that expertise that you can kind of tap into. But there are resources out there. But it's a complicated thing, and it's not insignificant.
So I have one more question here, and it's related to this slide. It says, so for regions that are white on this slide, there is no market mechanism, and they will fall, and they're, let's see, they will fall without a market. So basically, they're just saying there's no market whatsoever in the white areas. Is that right?
No, there is a market. It's the bilateral market. So, like in the West, the differentiation here is that anything that's colored is what we call a regional transmission organized market. So the organized market, like in California, remember I said it was made up of 3 big utilities that form the market? Well, in the rest of the country that's white, those utilities still exist. And those utilities are still operating in the bilateral world. And those utilities still are buying and selling among themselves to meet their there's a wholesale market that operates in all of those. It's just that it's a bilateral market. It's utility to utility rather than clearing under a centralized market. Okay?
Gotcha.
So there is a market. It's just a bilateral one-on-one instead of being cleared under a common centralized market. That's the distinction.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Al. This was a wonderful presentation. A lot of really good information. I appreciate all your time and effort in putting it together. For the audience, just remember these slides and the recording will be available for your viewing online at a later date. And I think by doing that, you can glean some of the denser information that maybe hard to pick up on the first time through. So here's a link for where you can go to get those past presentations, including this one. It won't be up for about a week, but in a week or so you should be able to get the whole audio as well as the slides from this and previous webinars. We already went through the questions. Now, the upcoming webinars in the 2018 series are listed here. The next one is the last Wednesday in June, and it's Evaluating Tribal Utility Authority Opportunities, and we look forward to having you participate in that webinar as well. So thanks for everyone's time today, and thank you, Al, so much for all your contributions to today's webinar.
Oh, you bet. And thank you guys for all the attendees. I appreciate it.
All right. Till next time, thanks. Bye-bye.